Hello, everyone, to episode 2 of the Parrhesia podcast. I'm here, joined again, once again, by Steven. And we're here again because we disagree on uh, another topic, which is actually very relevant in society today as well, which is civil disobedience. So many of you guys might be wondering what civil disobedience is. You might have not heard about this. Well, I'm sure after I give the definition, you definitely have a picture in mind on what civil disobedience is. So, civil disobedience is generally accepted or viewed as a public, nonviolent, and conscientious act of breaching the law, which is taken with the aim of bringing about some change in laws or government policies. So, in the status quo, we've seen, a lot of these movements, a lot of these instances of civil disobedience, whether that be the United Auto Workers strikes or um, also the strikes for the screenwriters and the script writers, right? And you can also see examples of civil disobedience from the past, most notably the civil rights movement and the feminist movement back then for women's suffrage. And um, those were examples of very successful ones, almost during that age of golden era of civil disobedience in the 60s. And then we're kind of seeing a resurgence of that right now. So as it's becoming a more relevant topic once again, there are a lot of debates on, the justifications of it. Is this warranted? Is bringing about the harms that it has also brought to the industries that they're concerned with, like, are those harms justified for their demands? And there are a lot of differing opinions on that. So that is what we're going to be debating about today. So I guess like my first question, maybe for you, Steven, to start us
hmm
off, would just be, just share your opinion on this topic. Like you could talk about it just in general. Do you think civil disobedience is ever warranted? And if so,
hmm
what are your personal criteria for when you think it is justified?
hmm First off, thank you again, Kahan, for inviting me on this podcast. I appreciate our last conversation very much. Um, so about civil disobedience, first I want to say, definitely I would agree there are past successful examples of civil disobedience that achieved the kind of results they envisioned, right? If we look back on all the civil rights movement that involves, from Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, there and Mahatma Gandhi, right? There are a lot of examples where civil disobedience definitely worked, right? But since the question you asked me is whether civil disobedience warranted, is justifiable, I guess one argument that simply makes me, you know, doubt the legitimacy or justification for civil disobedience is something I think you should be pretty familiar to, right? Let me provide a bit context. So I know we have a agreement in terms of free speech, especially about censoring a particular group of speech because whether it would cause harm or whether it cause others to feel discomfortable, right? We one argument that we don't want this kind of restriction is the slippery slope argument, right? Because if we disallow, right, a form of harmless speech, but later, with this precedent, we may be able to censor more speech, right? So that's one important argument that's used in the First Amendment, discussions, right, in terms of free speech. Um, so I think if we accept this use of slippery slope, right, note that slippery slope is not like a scientific deduction, right? It's just, if this happens, this may happen, right? This is not a scientific proof, but still, in some policy discussions, we accept the use of slippery slope, right? So that's a premise, right? Then, if we allow the same kind of slippery slope as a discussion analogy or like a talking point, then we could make the same argument that allowing or even recognizing certain forms of unlawful actions, and sometimes maybe even showing respect to this kind of unlawful actions, um, would further encourage more people to engage in unlawful actions and treat it or regard it as, hey, this is civil disobedience, right? And I think it would cause a slippery slope to, incite more people to disregard, disrespect, or even, break the law. This is something that I find really hard to wrestle with in, respecting civil disobedience. So that's my I agree, there are a lot of successful results, but if you ask me, I would say this is the hardest thing that I had to wrestle with when respecting civil disobedience.
Yeah, I agree with your point a lot. I think that it is also quite a popular argument
Mm-hmm.
for opponents of civil disobedience to say, right, which is that, we just gradually drive ourselves into a more anarchist society almost.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one thing that I would say in response to that, in terms of like one maybe flaw that I think I've kind of identified in
Sure.
that sort of counter argument, is that it's almost like the premise of the slippery slope is that, more people are encouraged to do things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do similar things after seeing successful actions of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your argument is basically that, people will start doing it recklessly. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that that will not be the case because of the fact that it is something to the extent of, breaking a law that would usually have severe consequences if, your act of civil disobedience would be successful, or would be, an issue that would encourage you to break the law in the first place, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think that, a lot of these maybe involve, losing your job, right? There have been a lot of uh uh like, for example, there have been a lot of efforts by corporations like Amazon and stuff to,
Mm-hmm.
to bust unions, right? Union busting was a really hot topic a few years ago, right? A lot of
Right.
people lost their jobs because of this. I don't think people would, just recklessly start putting their jobs and consequently their livelihoods at risk if just because, oh, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement was successful back then. Let me just, put my job at risk when I don't think I have a chance of success, or when, you know, people around me don't really support me. I feel like people would still weigh the risks with the likelihood of their desired outcome before,
Mm-hmm.
they they partake in uh these actions, right? And also, I think that even if it still stands that, the slippery slope works, and, a lot of people are, you know engaging in civil disobedience, I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily,
Okay.
because one thing Martin Luther King said, uh, I from his letter from a Birmingham jail, was that civil disobedience is unique in a sense that it creates a sense of tension and crisis in the government,
Mm-hmm.
to the extent that, and they dramatize this issue by breaking the law to the extent to which the government can no longer ignore their needs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that in this case, if, so many people are so determined to have their voices heard and have their demands met, that, they 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 are willing to break the law and consequently risk having a criminal record, or risk, losing their job and their livelihoods, right? I think that would be quite a shocking but necessary, wake up
Mm-hmm.
call, reality check for the government, that, you cannot just keep on ignoring the needs,
Mm-hmm.
of your people. Because after all, like, if everybody's doing that, the power of the collective is extremely powerful. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that if there are so many if there are so many acts of civil disobedience going on at the same time, that would really, turn a switch on, in the government's mind. I don't necessarily think that people would want to go into an anarchist society themselves. I think they go through civil disobedience because they have they've exhausted other means. I think they've exhausted, legal means, and, they're like, well, all right, these methods didn't work, these safer methods didn't work. I'm still here, nothing has changed. I'm going to have to break the law in order
Mm-hmm.
to be heard. So I think that, you know, their end goal wouldn't be just to, live without laws, but rather to have, have this law revised, or have this specific law abolished, and maybe a new law
Mm-hmm.
put in place, uh, replacing that one. Yeah. So like that's generally what I think. Like
Hmm.
in my response to, that anarchist slippery slope argument. I don't know if you
Right,
have any responses or any clarifications.
right. I detect like three strands of argument in your response. One is from a more, uh, um, like statistical or like in reality, right? Whether this kind of recognition encourages more, unlawful activities, right? I think this is an empirical question, right? Um, we can talk about that. And then the second argument you made is, civil disobedience is a form of dramatizing a need of certain group of citizens, right? And this form of dramatization is sometimes warranted and needed to encourage or facilitate social change, right? This is the second one. And the third one you mentioned, when there's no other means than civil disobedience, the only recourse, right? So that's the third argument. What do you say we address them, one by one?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah? Okay,
Yeah.
sure. Maybe we can start with the empirical one, right? I think what you say is definitely warranted, especially in terms of unionizing, because I guess it's because it deals with mostly private companies who have more, you know, legal recourse to, protest and disobedience, right? Um, Unlike the government, right? But I guess the thing is, it's not a matter of whether it can or whether it cannot, cause more, disregard or unlawful activities, right? Because sometimes one or just a few would bear, pretty significant and bearable consequences. For instance, you mentioned quite a few examples where um, unlawful activities were not encouraged or even prohibited or even discouraged, right? But I guess consider in recent years, right, especially I think in California, um, the the bar for burglary felony was getting higher, right? In Chinese, people joke it as 零元购, as if people can go into stores and just you know shoplift and without any consequences. And I even like I recall reading some Black Lives Matter activists saying this is actually a form of civil disobedience, right? This is a form of protest against the kind of conditions and discrimination Black people face in the system, right? We're not evaluating this claim, right? But I think at least you could see one example where, you know, yeah, civil disobedience was used whether as a rationale, you could say it's a rationale, you could say it's an excuse, right? We're not getting into that, but at least you see how it was used to, produce unlawful activities, right? And it caused a lot of there were a lot of social costs, right? There were a lot of damage on private property, right? And even a lot of people just rich people decided to moving out of California, so the tax income drops, so less police presence in certain neighborhoods. So it's like a vicious cycle, right? So I would definitely agree with you. There are measures to discourage unlawful activity, but it could also can, right? So then it becomes an empirical question about what level can cause the cost that we can accept, and what level of encouragement can cause the cost that we cannot accept, right? So I guess on this question, I feel like it's more like an empirical one, right? But
Yeah.
I yeah, what do you think about this example?
Yeah, I do agree with you. Like, I think statistically there are going to
Hmm.
be, unfortunate examples like these where, things do kind of lean towards the anarchist society that
Right.
opponents of civil disobedience kind of predict. But I think that it can also still be looked this, even though this is a mainly empirical issue, I think we can still
Mm-hmm.
look at it slightly through reason or
Sure.
through reason, because I think that, like you said, a lot of people, moved out of
Mm-hmm.
California, probably a lot less support for those actions, a lot more controversy regarding
Mm-hmm.
that, a lot sharper divide perhaps. And that is precisely, I think, what a civil movement, like a social movement, does not want. They don't want
Mm-hmm.
more division. They don't want more controversy. They want to garner support through, acts of nonviolence, um, through acts of breaking the law,
Mm-hmm.
and they want more of their community or society to empathize with their cause, right?
Yeah.
So I think that even though that happened, it's written in the books, it's happened, like
Mm-hmm.
you said in the Black Lives Matter movement. Um, I think that the movement wouldn't gravitate towards that, or the norm wouldn't gravitate towards those actions because of its divisive nature, because of um, the lower likelihood of that garnering support than a peaceful demonstration on the street, or a peaceful demonstration outside of the Capitol or the Supreme Court,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or you know protesting during a sports game or during the Olympics like they did back then. I think that through reason, we can see that, empirically, statistically speaking, these instances are still significantly less likely to happen due to just this divisive nature and its counterproductive nature, perhaps. Um, yeah, I think that would be just my main rebuttal to that issue. But yes, I
Mm-hmm.
agree with you that, you know, uh, yeah, there will be these bad apples. We just hope that, through looking at the past and learning from these past examples that, like you've brought up, that
Mm-hmm.
it'll become less likely. I'm curious to learn about like your opinion on, perhaps we can maybe dive a little deeper into this, like in terms of um like where do you then do you think you draw the line that draws the line? Like where do you think the line is drawn for you in terms of when you stop supporting a social movement, or when you stop supporting an act of civil disobedience within a social movement?
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems clear, like from your example earlier, that you were a little skeptical about that specific act of civil disobedience. So where do you think the
Mm-hmm.
line is drawn for you?
That's a that's a tough question. Yeah. Okay. Let me, this is basically like a thinking out loud. Maybe we can try to work it through together.
Yeah.
Um, so first off, maybe I can bring an example from my college experience, right? Um, I guess one protest or something that I slightly disapproved of, right? Um, so during my senior year, there was a grad student strike, right? Because at that time, the grad student was trying to form a union, or maybe they just did form a union, right? Because the living cost at Illinois, specifically Chicago, is rising, and the grad students they weren't being paid enough, so they basically unionized and they had a strike, where most grad students work as teaching assistant or sometimes discussion leaders, right? So they were very civil in the sense that they notified the student. They were willing to talk to students, including me, about why they're doing this and this what cause they're fighting for, right? Then they notified us, right? They're okay, so we're going to have a strike, so we couldn't lead this discussion, but we're really willing to tell you why we do this, right? So they were really civil in doing that. Um, but one thing they did was that they were forming a picket line, you know, holding hands together and
Mhm.
um, preventing people from entering into main buildings, right?
Mm.
So um, they didn't like completely block out all the buildings, all the entrances, right? So a building typically have several, right? They just blocked out the most, the prominent ones, right? But I think at that time, people were having a discussion about whether it's okay to cross the picket line, right? Like they're not gonna fight you if I force my way into through their like holding hands, their picket, right? It's just they will say I'm rude, right? Um, and the students were also encouraging professors to join them and stop their sessions or lectures at the time where they protest, right? So this is something I wasn't, like protesting, forming a picket line. I guess that's okay, but um, when they stop me from going having my education because I pay tuition, I pay for going to school, right? Um, that's when I feel my interests were at least in conflict with theirs, right? I'm not saying, my interests like definitely always theirs, but I just feel um if I'm pressured in, siding with them, then what about, I feel like I just feel uncomfortable, doing that because they're definitely something that I want, right? And I guess they could make the argument that, uh, they could say to me, hey, if you join us, then in the future people will fight for you, right? Even though I'm not a stakeholder, right? Even though it's not my interest that's on the line, but they still want my support. But I just feel like my interest lies out there. So I guess to generalize from this experience, I would feel a little bit uncomfortable when my interest was negatively impacted in civil disobedience. And of course, I just want to bracket that with, if we use the example of civil rights movement, right? White people could say the same thing, right? But I think on further examination, you could argue that, hey, there are actually some unequal treatment at that time, right? Some of your white people's interests are not legitimate, right? They're not reasonable. They're not justifiable. So I guess that's a response to the civil rights movement. But off the top of my head, I think my interest, at a university going to classes is justifiable and reasonable, I would say. Maybe they could make an argument, when I pay my tuition, the school wasn't allocating enough portion to them. Maybe they could say that. But that's another whole series of calculation. Let's put it this way. Okay. I guess when my interest is unfairly um,
Mm.
impacted, in a negative sense, that's when I, you know, draw the line. Yeah, maybe we can start with that.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good observation because I think that might be a very strong determinant in terms of what
Mm-hmm.
makes what makes certain acts of civil disobedience more successful than others.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that I would I think I wholly agree with you on this.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly, I think maybe just thinking out loud again, back to reciprocating that. I think I can also think of because I personally have not experienced any form of civil
Mm-hmm.
disobedience. I haven't been personally impacted, but you know, I've seen online about of many different instances of civil disobedience either going
Mm-hmm.
well or going poorly. And what I do observe in terms of why people don't support the movement um, is also still strongly tied to like what you said, is when
Mm-hmm.
their personal interests are being compromised or unfairly impacted
Mm-hmm.
negatively. Um, Most notably, what I can think of is Just Stop Oil. They're
Mm-hmm.
very controversial now, but
Mm-hmm.
you could argue to an extent that their message has been coming through
Mm-hmm.
because of the controversy, but I think that they've also lost a lot of potential supporters because of that controversy. um uh One example I can think of, one of many examples I think of is also the protesters making a picket line, but
Mm-hmm.
they're extremely daring. They're making that picket line on a public road, or sometimes even
Right.
a highway, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
you see instances of certain drivers just being fed up and, almost just driving through them
Yeah.
and, trying to run them over actively. And I think that most of them probably don't do that action because they
Mm-hmm.
firmly don't believe in the existence or in the harms of climate change, or they firmly don't believe in their cause, but rather they don't agree with, or they're fed up with the way that they are trying to convey that cause or trying
Mm-hmm.
to garner support. Because essentially, in that case, when their interests are compromised, they feel like they're the target, but they feel like they're the one that the movement is antagonizing. So it creates this animosity between them. Like maybe it wasn't animosity for your example, but maybe that's like a little extreme. But you probably felt like, a little bit targeted or a little bit antagonized if you do walk through, like you said, you would be considered rude or inconsiderate or unsupportive of the movement if you did walk through the
Mm-hmm.
picket line. But maybe it's just, hey, I get your cause, but I want to go to class because I paid for this, right?
Yeah.
Same thing there, right? Like, cool, I support your movement, but I have a job I need to go to, or I have a family to go home to. I can't be bothered to sit here in the motorway and like look at you sit on the ground while no one really cares, right? And like another example would be, I think a famous example I found was during this, I think like this sort of charity car show event where, there were entry tickets and all the proceeds like went to some sort of, I think an organization that helped like children in need.
Mm-hmm.
Uh I think a few Just Stop Oil protesters also went in there, and another action that they do all the time is, super glue their hands to, uh ultra luxury cars or like sports cars that are gasoline powered, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they were known for in that instance they super glued their hands and also just poured super glue over these like multi-million dollar like Ferrari collection or something, right?
Right.
And uh I'm pretty sure uh like that Ferrari owner like came out and basically just said, like, hey, like I understand uh your cause, and I
Mm-hmm.
do understand, I acknowledge the harms of global warming. Uh, but I think you're targeting the wrong person here because, firstly, these classic cars are barely driven, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
only fired up to just make sure they're running mechanically so they can be trailered, not even driven. They're like transported to these shows, right? Because they're so priceless. And even then, I think that person was just like, an investor of and, a user of, sustainable fuels and powers all their cars by with sustainable fuels that are nearly net zero. So once again, like that animosity that's created because of that conflicting interest, that conflict in interest or that compromise of one's interests
Mm-hmm.
almost like makes them antagonize and are significantly less likely to support that movement, right?
Yeah. Actually, let
Yes.
me ask a tough question to you, right? To reciprocate a tough question you throw at me. Because as we work our way through here, right, trying to find a line between, what kind of civil disobedience we would support and what kind we probably wouldn't, right? I notice a tension between, on the one hand, like you said, sometimes it's a civil disobedience, it's not civil obedience, right?
Mm,
And
yeah.
to use your word, like we need to dramatize the ingredients, right? Sometimes we need to do things that makes others uncomfortable, right? For instance, like Rosa Parks, right? Yeah, I'm sitting here, so another man or a white man wouldn't be able to sit. That's that person probably would be uncomfortable, right? That
Mm,
would inflict on a little bit of his interest, right?
yeah.
Um, but on the other hand, um, like the examples you mentioned about, stopping, oil or the picket line, sometimes the the way these protesters or disobedience, like when they do things, they don't really achieve the kind of effects they want to achieve, right? But they were still causing discomfort, but somehow it wasn't that beneficial, that helpful, right? So I detect like a more trickier line to draw
Yeah.
between, what's a movement or what's a tactic that can, inspire people, right? Like Martin Luther King didn't just have black supporters. He
Yeah.
had white supporters, right?
Mhm.
Um, but some activists, some unsuccessful activists, they only manage to antagonize others.
Yes.
So I'm curious, Han, if you like distinguish between these two extremes, what do you think that makes them different?
Yeah, I could see this question coming. And it is a really tough one, I think.
Yeah.
But I think just off the top of my head, my initial response to that is that a clear differentiating factor between less divisive examples of civil disobedience, like the civil rights movement with Rosa Parks sitting at the back of the bus, refusing to give up. I mean, no, sitting at the from the bus, like refusing to give
Mm-hmm.
up her seat, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that of Just Stop Oil, which you know maybe hasn't made as much ground or hasn't been viewed uh more there hasn't been that sort of consensus that the civil rights movement that the
Mm-hmm.
people have viewed the civil rights movement with. I think the clear distinction is that for the civil rights movement and like the example of Rosa Parks or like those sit-ins at restaurants, right? Is that yes, they did conflict the interests of um, white people that probably would like to sit on that seat, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't their main focus. That wasn't their main selling point, right? That wasn't the only thing they did or what was their trademark move, you could say, right? They
Mm-hmm.
didn't focus on just saying, oh, you white people that are sitting here should give up your seat for me, or I shouldn't give up to you. Like, who are you, right? They didn't focus on disrespecting um the white people that they should be giving the seat to, that they don't know. But instead, they were doing these actions and saying, well, I'm not giving up my seat because the government needs to change something here. The government needs to stop their segregation, their Jim Crow laws, right? And segregation, and let me sit on this bar stool with white people, or let me sit somewhere else with a white person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that's a key differentiating factor in terms of the significance or the prominence of um uh that conflicting interest or that compromisation of interest, right? Like, because I think
Mm-hmm.
going back to maybe Just Stop Oil. Um, I think they could get a lot more supporters if creating this animosity or this conflict of interest wasn't their trademark thing, right? Because they're known for all these. Their tactic is basically brewing controversy to make sure they can't ignore it. Which,
Mm-hmm.
okay, to a certain extent, is successful, but in terms of garnering support, hasn't been as successful. I think that one thing they could do is stop almost just making it an us versus them battle, but rather
Mm-hmm.
it's us as a whole finding a common ground and urging the government to take more action in the right
Mm-hmm.
direction, right? I think they still need to take into account the fact that like one thing they could simply do to persuade a lot of perhaps like those super wealthy car owners to further support their movement instead of super gluing themselves onto their cars, multi-million-dollar cars, is maybe another cause is showing these pictures of amazing scenery, right, that they probably love driving on, right, and saying that if we don't have higher carbon tax, or if we don't have you know further more investment into sustainable fuel options, right, or sustainable energy alternatives, this will
Mm-hmm.
be gone, right? These forests that you drive along the mountains that you can see when you drive along the mountainside will be gone, right? Or like the snow caps on the Alps will no longer be snowy, right? The
Mm-hmm.
beauty of it will be taken away. I think you still need to work together with them. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
you might not agree with their stance on you might believe that there's no way, like there's no case where a combustion engine car uh would be you know uh justified to own, right? You might have differing viewpoints, but I think that the common cause, or if you're trying to garner more support, you need to a certain extent set aside certain more minor differences if the support you can get for like overall would be significantly greater. like I think we can still look at that through the civil rights movement, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we when we look at the civil rights movement, we look at it in as a whole, right? But even then,
Mm-hmm.
there were still a lot of conflicting interests in terms of what should be done um within that movement, right? Like whether or not to whether like violence or non-violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was a point of contention as well, right? So I think like not necessarily they need to serve or like purely cater to the needs of people, but
Mm-hmm.
rather not make it a sort of us versus them or like, oh, you're not a part of this when
Mm-hmm.
like shutting out people even before, even though beforehand they might have been, either neutral or, slightly interested in your movement. And I think that would that would be like the more fine line, but within that line. I
Gotcha.
don't know, what are your thoughts about that?
Gotcha. I think that's definitely sound advice for Just Stop Oil activists, right? But I could see it this your this way of drawing this line would sort of contradicts one very important justifying reason for civil disobedience, which I know, like, many philosophers try to justify the civil disobedience by using the last resort um
Yeah.
rationale, right? This is the last thing that we could do, this is the only thing that we could do, hence yeah, we could only do that, right? So I see the power of this rationale, right? Because we are respecting or encouraging people to disregard or disrespect the law, right? So it must be something that's very powerful. Only at that time we could allow, a temporary disregard of the law, right? So the last resort rationale makes sense, right? But to use the just stop oil example, apparently, like when they can do that, uh, when they can act on the advice you just gave, um, then what they were doing definitely wasn't the last resort, right? There are definitely more things that they could do, right? Which then means, hey, this is perhaps not a legitimate use of civil disobedience, right? And um, I think this is one thing that for me is very hard to wrestle with. Is the ambiguity of being a last resort, right? It's really tough to think of, um, minus the civil rights movement, right? When there were like legal systematic impediments to suffrage, to Black people's rights, right? But still, you can make the argument that it was a law that changed, right? Law did change. So um, I guess my point is, when you try to draw the line between a successful or like between a good civil disobedience versus a bad technique, it definitely showed that there are room for deliberation, right? There are room for more variety of actions, which
Mhm.
sort of disqualify civil disobedience as a last resort, because when that happens, that's like the only option, right? Only that kind of emergency, I think, would justify temporarily disregard the law. um so this is, I don't know if that makes sense, but I think this is something I noticed, like a tension and a contradiction. What do you think?
Yeah, I understand your point, but I think I would still say that it would still be considered civil disobedience, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
there are just different ways you can break the law. I think the only way you can break the law is not like, I mean, like super gluing your hand to a car, like creating this sort of picket line on a motorway isn't the only way you can break a law to get your message across. You can
True.
also break a
That's true.
can you can also break a law by, you know, disobeying officers' orders to,
Mm-hmm.
disperse or to stop protesting. You can also, deface like, the front of, a large like energy factory, that a
Mm-hmm.
large like coal burning factory, right? You could do
Right.
that. Like I think what I was talking about earlier was more about the message that you convey through the civil disobedience. through the attention that you've gathered by breaking the law. Like, another extreme act or like more radical and divisive act for like the environmental awareness campaign is eco-terrorism, right? That's a very controversial topic, right?
Yeah,
Do we
yeah,
do we blow up the plant or do we just vandalize the plant, right? Those
right.
two are like both acts of civil disobedience to different extents, right? I mean, you can also see this through the civil rights movement, right? Malcolm
Mm,
X was like known to be, have a more violence oriented, more retaliate, like more like favorable of retaliation, while Martin Luther
right.
King was like, just marching in solidarity and peace and singing with arms linked down like the streets and from town to town, right?
Mm,
And like I think you can also see this through, Black Lives Matter, as you said, right? Civil disobedience doesn't always equal to, shoplifting, right? It can also be,
right.
just protesting in front of, your local court, in front of the Supreme Court, as many people did after Roe versus Wade, right? So I think like it's what you put on those signs or what you convey or what you say to justify your other actions of civil disobedience that is the distinction. Um, because I feel like I still feel like, I mean, it's up to debate on whether or not it is a last resort, like you said,
Hmm.
for uh social movements like Just Stop Oil to, do what they do.
Hmm.
But like an argument can be made for both, but I think like on the premise that like if it is considered a justified act of civil disobedience, this is what they can do better, or this
Hmm.
is what would make it even more justified, or like what would make their intentions more justified or make their chances of success greater, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Right. I think that that distinction between, varieties, various way of breaking the law, versus the message, I think that that's really helpful. I'm persuaded on that point. Yeah, I
Uh,
appreciate that. Um, but I think for the, the last resort argument,
mm,
I'm still hesitating, right? Um, because what at this point, when we look at civil rights movement, we will have a historical bias. We will say, yeah, of course, at that time, they had no choice. That was the
mm,
only way, right? Um, we say that partly, this is just one interpretation, right? Partly because they succeeded, right?
mm,
I'm sure there were other civil rights movements that failed, but also, using civil disobedience, right? And when they failed, we probably feel like, yeah, that just wasn't it, right? They're using the wrong tactics. This is not the right time, right? Think about, besides just stop oil, think about maybe animal rights,
mm,
right? I think to make an argument is not that difficult, right? To say, do you believe we should eliminate suffering as much as possible? Most people would say yes, right? Do you believe in we should, minimize killing as much as possible? Yes. And then killing an animal is killing a life, right? Killing an animal causes suffering. And when there are viable substitute for, other proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, then what's the reasoning we have for, not adapting to veganism, right? And there are a lot of, veganism activists, um, finding different methods to advocate for their belief, right? And to them, they could make a compelling argument that, yeah, sometimes civil disobedience is the last resort because this cow, this chicken, right, are about to be killed. Of course, this is the last resort, right? This warrants me to shut down this plant, this butchery, whatever, right?
mm,
I can imagine they make this argument, but I think most of us wouldn't feel that persuaded. We'll say things like, well, that's a cow, we're a human being. But that argument, that's not saying anything, right? Yeah, they're facts, they're a cow, but they're a human being, but you're still lives, right? Then perhaps someone will say, yeah, not all lives are equal, right? This is just a cow, but we are human beings.
mm.
But still, I mean, the argument could go on and on, right? We could cite
Yeah.
examples where, people were in a coma, long-term coma, who could only, digest through, tube feeding or whatever, which is basically like what, factory fed chicken were like,
Yeah.
right? Um, so the argument, we're not talking about like veganism and that kind of stuff, but
Yeah.
we could imagine a case where a veganism activist would say, hey, this is the last resort. This is the only thing we can do. But the majority of people, or most people in the society, wouldn't agree with that argument, wouldn't agree that this is the last resort,
Mm.
right? So I think there must be cases where, the last resort argument is so ambiguous that it ceases to
Yeah.
explain the legitimacy of civil disobedience. And when we talk about civil rights movement, we are just sort of biased because these are the successful ones, right? When you
Mhm.
look at the successful ones, yeah, everything checks, right? But if you consider also the unsuccessful ones, that's where maybe this rationale wouldn't, be so powerful. Yeah, that's my point.
Yeah, that's actually a very different or maybe like even refreshing perspective in terms of this debate. I do agree with you, like to a certain extent that, maybe our interpretation of the fundamental framework that justifies social movements are heavily influenced by the outcome or with the benefit
Hmm.
of uh like looking back, right? But I still think that it can be applied to a certain extent because or like I think that this framework still remains true to a certain extent because I feel like at least okay like for the example of veganism or
Hmm.
like acts of civil disobedience in that sense, I think that the last resort here wouldn't be in terms of the physical life of one specific truckload of pigs or one specific batch of chickens, right?
Hmm.
But rather the sense of urgency or the sense that it's a last resort comes from failure to, lobby for laws that tax um these corporations or failure to, pressure the government to subsidize these plant-based alternatives or failure to, you know, have their voices heard in the first place. What if their platforms were their platforms to spread their message was silence, right?
Hmm.
I feel like maybe that's where the criteria for last resort comes from in terms of achieving their end goal of, not saving that specific chicken, but saving the future lives of chickens through, laws or
Hmm.
through persuasion. I mean, okay, not through persuasion because like
Yeah, that would be
that's the whole point.
another.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I got a little carried away there, but yeah, like through
Yeah.
through through other means, like through other legal means to enact, legal
Right.
change mainly, right? And I feel like maybe then the argument would be that, I mean, I'm not informed on, the success or lack of success,
Hmm.
or like the specific context of the veganism movement. But I feel like if one were to say that their acts of civil disobedience are unwarranted or unjustified, they would say, hey, look, um, a lot of politicians in your state or in your area are actually, supportive of your movement, are actively trying to, raise awareness about this. You should try, you know, um, campaigning for that, right? I mean, you have the support within the government to try and campaign for change, right? You can take to social media and just say that, or like, look, hey, um, you know, you could like the government itself, like the president maybe like, is willing to like recognize the merits of your argument, right? I feel like that would be then a warranted kind of
Hmm.
critique on the justification. I think the lack of success is another story because I mean, the civil rights movement, even though it was successful, it was after decades
Right.
of,
A long time.
even like a century of, this prejudice, right?
Right.
Same with the, women's suffrage movement. I mean, heck, the feminist movement right now is still fighting for, equal pay
Mm-hmm.
after all these years, right? But we wouldn't say that the feminist movement, in terms of whenever they do an act of civil disobedience, maybe when female workers go on strike or whatever, that, it might not be justified. Um, because yeah, like that, I think that's a clear distinction to make in terms of between success and the fundamental righteousness of the action.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think like that was a like looking back at this discussion that we've had and like almost circling back to the prompt, maybe even as we close out this discussion, is that um we might have, differing viewpoints, or we might agree on, the difference between the success of a movement and
Mm-hmm.
the fundamental justification of that movement in the first place. And in the end, maybe that, success could be an indicator of whether or not it was justified in the first place. Because, I do recognize that side of the argument, when like, if people don't think it's justified, they won't support it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
if people do see it as a last resort, I will support it. I do see the merits of that argument as well. So maybe just circling back to the prompt, coming full circle in terms of, you know, when is civil disobedience justified? It could be, if it was a last resort, or if there was like been long-standing injustice, or
Mm-hmm.
if people support it even, that could be a reason for it as well. Because ultimately it is a social movement, right?
Right.
So
I'll
yeah.
I'll give you that. I will give you I think what you said about the last resort, that makes sense. But see if we can, agree on this following claim that the last resort argument has a very high epistemic bar. Let's see if we can agree on that. That's a really tough thing to satisfy, I would say, right?
Yes.
Um, do you agree on that?
Yeah, I do
Okay.
agree. It's like
Yeah.
it's very ambiguous. It's also very subjective, and like you said, it's like very high
Right.
epistemic part in terms of what counts as a last resort. Like, do like what counts as exhausting all those other means that, and are those other means more justified, or less risky or less divisive? You know,
Right.
for civil disobedience. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it was there was like an Asian common law case in England in the 17th century or something. Um, like a bunch of people were exploring at a cave or on the sea, something like that, several people, but they run out of food and water, so they have to, take turns killing, one person, and people eat this person, like engage in cannibalism, right?
Yeah.
Until the last person, right? But that person, as I recall, was pardoned by the Queen of England or something, or the King, because it was truly regarded as a last resort, right?
Hmm.
I think that was a clear case. It was either me leaving, or I had to engage in agreed upon cannibalism, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that was agreed upon. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think this is actually maybe there were some complications to that case, but hypothetically, right?
Hmm.
If it was agreed upon cannibalism, I guess there were some, at least there was, most people agree, yeah, this is a last resort situation, right? Like, yeah,
Yeah.
either you die or he dies. Um, but that was a clear case. I
Hmm.
think like it wasn't even this obvious, even in civil rights movements. I mean, like at that time, like a majority
Yeah.
of the racist American, right, they could say, yeah, you can go through your regular means, right? This is not like, right, so urgent,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess just this rationale has a super high epistemic bar that I just envision it very difficult to be met. Um, which makes this argument as a justification for civil disobedience, very less useful.
Yeah.
That's what I would say, right? I will agree with you that if it's a truly last resort, yeah, go ahead. I'm persuaded. This is a
Hmm.
legitimate use of unlawful action, but it's super rare, right? Um,
Mm.
well, like to make an analogy, right? I feel like that's like when people debate about abortion,
Yeah.
right? You know, the pro-abortion use cases like rape and incest, right?
Mm.
Um, to justify, you know, sometimes some people use that to justify, you know, abortion, you know, all the way, right? Um,
Hmm.
and some, I guess this is not in the United States, but like I guess some, you know, anti-abortion would grant that, you know, right? If it's a result of rape and incest, yeah, sure, go ahead. But for others, no, right? I
Yeah.
think this is sort of like my stance in terms of civil disobedience. If it's a truly last resort, sure. But
Mm.
if it's others, yeah. So yeah, I'm glad
Yeah.
we, you know, land on some agreement through this discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I learned a lot as well. Like I think that especially just that last part on, what counts as a last resort is actually
Hmm.
a very important thing to keep in mind when justifying civil disobedience. If we are to use that as a framework for justification, sort of, is it really a last resort? Do we know for sure it is a last resort or is it not? Yeah. Well, what are your closing thoughts or any other like remarks?
Yeah, I think I had a more sophisticated perspective on, you know, how to justify civil disobedience, right? Because I do see there are more factors to consider besides, you know, a simple disregard of the law, right? You know, that's certainly one aspect, but there are other compelling interests that could be balanced with, right? Um, yeah, so I think I have more factors to consider in evaluating a case of civil disobedience. And I also like the last part of you know, the last resort discussion on the last resort. Yeah, I like that part of the discussion. Yeah.
Me too. Yeah. So yeah, I guess that concludes our discussion. Like, thank you once again for being a fantastic guest and also facilitator of this discussion as well, and almost
Thank you
playing
for
devil's
having me.
advocate at some point. Yeah, I really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope you did too.
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
Hope to be on this podcast again.
yeah, definitely. We'll see you soon.
See ya.